Speaker.
Grant. Oh, the question is the motion be agreed to. Grant Roberts.
I was waiting for that. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Labor Party is supporting this legislation, but with some significant reservations, which I will come to shortly. But as with many taxation bills that come before this House, there is an element of tidying up, making the incredibly arcane and intricate measures of the Income Tax and the Tax Administration Act a little more usable for those who have to work with them, and elements of the bill do useful things in that, particularly around the simplification of tax for business. And I want to thank and credit the National Government for picking up Labor's excellent flexible tax for business policy that we announced earlier in the year, seeing the wisdom of that great piece of work put together by Clayton Cosgrove and Jacinda Ardern at the time. Excellent piece of work, and pleased to see that the government took them a little while, but pleased to see the government come on board with that tax simplification process, and also the implementation of the automatic exchange of financial information. Again, issues that New Zealand has been involved in discussing at the OECD, finding their way into New Zealand law, which is entirely appropriate, Mr. Speaker. So on those elements of the legislation, the Labor Party is happy to support what has come in front of the House. The area that I want to devote most of my speech to, though, Mr. Speaker, is the final element that the Minister mentioned, and that is that this is the piece of legislation that implements the new disclosure requirements for foreign trusts, indeed, as the commentary to the bill says, as recommended by the government inquiry into foreign trust disclosure rules, otherwise known as the Schuin report, John Schuin having undertaken that for the government. And Mr. Speaker, it's worth taking a step back, because this is actually one of the most grubby parts of the former Prime Minister's time in office, and one that does not reflect well upon him or indeed upon the government. Because if we rewind the clock to August 2013, the hard-working officials in the Inland Revenue Department were telling the government that it was time to tighten up New Zealand's foreign trust disclosure regime. They were concerned about the impact on New Zealand's reputation, the fact that there was a mismatch between what New Zealand did with its lax rules around foreign trusts and what was happening in the rest of the world, that we were becoming a safe harbour for money that people wanted to hide. Not, as we were told occasionally during the Select Committee, about people, the many people being persecuted around the world. For sure, there may be one or two of those people who look to shift their money to a jurisdiction like New Zealand. But far and away, those who are misusing our foreign trust regime, who are taking New Zealand's good and hard-earned reputation and trashing it, were the target of the rules that John Schuin suggested, and the target of the IRD in 2013. But the government rejected that approach. But by the end of 2013, it was on the IRD's work program to tighten up foreign trust rules. And that set alarm bells ringing in the foreign trust industry. And as we now famously know, the Prime Minister's then lawyer and close confidant, Ken Whitney, got on the phone, or actually approached the Prime Minister and spoke to him. The Prime Minister said, "Don't worry about it, talk to Todd McClay, nothing will happen here." And you know what happened, Mr. Speaker? The IRD backed off, faced with the inside lobbying of the Prime Minister's lawyer on behalf of the foreign trust industry. 3 years have been wasted, Mr. Speaker, not tightening up our laws. 3 years of opening up a loophole for people who wanted to hide money in New Zealand. And Mr. Speaker, it was a disgraceful response initially from the government, and it was only the arrival of the Panama Papers that meant that the government was forced to act. And even then, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's first reaction was to defend the foreign trust industry, not to support or enhance New Zealand's reputation, not to tighten the rules to make sure that New Zealand taxpayers who do the right thing can have confidence in their tax system. No, the Prime Minister's first response was to defend his old mates. And then when the pressure went on, he said, right, we've got to do something. And so John Schuin was appointed to do the inquiry, and Mr. Schuin did a very good report. In that report, there were a number of recommendations that have been taken up in this bill, and that includes much clearer disclosure requirements. We need to know who the trustees are, Who are the beneficiaries of the trust? Where do they live? What is their tax status? All of that information will now be provided to the IRD, as it always should have been, and as opposition parties have been proposing for some time. But critically, Mr. Speaker, this legislation misses out two things from John Sherwin's report. And the one I want to focus on now is the fact that he proposed an immediate implementation of phase 2 of the anti-money laundering rules. These are the rules that would bring real estate agents and lawyers and accountants into the same regime that banks and insurance advisors and even casinos currently have to obey, that would bring us just up to the standard of the rest of the world. This was meant to be done immediately, John Sherwin said. We need to safeguard our reputation. We need to tighten the rules. And the government has not put that in this legislation, Mr. Speaker, and it is a deep weakness of this legislation. Because we know it is through the real estate agents, the lawyers and the accountants that most of that money laundering activity is taking place. Anyone, I saw Suzanne Snively from Transparency International on TV just this week say, anyone involved in the real estate industry in Auckland knows that money laundering is taking place through that industry. The government knows that, and they're dragging their feet. They're dragging their feet. We had Amy Adams tell us that they would get this in, that they would get legislation into Parliament this year. There's one day to go, Mr. Speaker. It's not happening. There will be no legislation this year, as Amy Adams promised. John Key said in May that the government would be accelerating implementation of the anti-money laundering thing. And no, he just applied the brakes. And what we know, Mr. Speaker, is that Amy Adams was doing her job. She was taking papers to the cabinet committees saying, we need to get this done. And it was John Key and Stephen Joyce who sat at that cabinet committee and said, you know what? The heat's gone off the Panama Papers. We don't really need to get into this now. Stephen Joyce was worried, no doubt worried about the donors to the National Party who he might be offending if he actually did the right thing here. And so the work wasn't done, Mr. Speaker. And so we stand here today with a piece of legislation that's missing its crucial element. If we're really serious in this House about cracking down on the misuse of trusts, about making sure that New Zealanders can have confidence in their own tax system, about making sure that our hard-earned reputation in the world as a fair place with a transparent and accountable tax system is upheld, then this bill should have the extension of those anti-money laundering rules. But it doesn't, because the government is still more interested in looking after their mates than they are in looking after New Zealand's reputation. And just this week, Mr. Speaker, just this week, we learned that Jose Mourinho, the manager of the Manchester United football team, stands accused. I knew this would upset David Bennett. Nothing would upset David Bennett more than his beloved Manchester United getting dragged into this. Well, Mr. Bennett, there's nothing to be proud of here. This is a man who stands accused of hiding his money in a trust in New Zealand. Headlines around the world again, Mr. Speaker. New Zealand's the place to hide your money. It is time, Mr. Speaker, for this government to do the right thing, to get these rules in place. We've had discussion documents endlessly, and now another one is being released, Mr. Speaker, to delay this one more time. And it's my strong prediction, Mr. Speaker, that if we are even lucky enough in this House to see a bill come forward from the government, there is no hope that it will be passed before the 2017 election. And that is another broken promise from the government, Mr. Speaker. There are things in this bill that are useful and important for our taxation system. But there is a blot on this government and on New Zealand for the fact that we have been a destination for dirty money, for people who want to hide what they're doing in the world. The government had the chance in this bill to do the right thing and bring into force these rules, and they have completely failed, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Greens and New Zealand First for joining in the minority report that stands in this piece of legislation. In that report, we call on the government and say to them, do the right thing, implement the anti-money money laundering rules so that New Zealanders can once again have confidence in their taxation system.